Husband humiliates his wife during a wedding they were attending and shocks all guests. The next day, he wakes up and finds a letter that makes him regret doing so. David adjusted his tie for the third time, scrutinizing his reflection in the full-length mirror. His tailored suit fit perfectly, accentuating his tall, lean frame. He ran a hand through his neatly trimmed dark hair, a hint of premature gray at the temples, giving him a distinguished look. At 35, he was at the peak of his career as a corporate lawyer, and he knew it. "Chloe, we're going to be late," he called out, impatience evident in his voice. He checked his expensive watch, a gift from a grateful client, and frowned. A moment later, Chloe appeared in the doorway of their bedroom. She wore a flowing navy blue dress that complemented her curves. Her honey blonde hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she'd applied light makeup that enhanced her natural beauty. Despite her efforts, there was a hint of uncertainty in her blue eyes as she looked at her husband. "How do I look?" she asked, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. David's eyes roamed over her figure, his expression unreadable. "It'll do," he said finally, turning back to the mirror to adjust his cufflinks. "Though you might want to skip the appetizers at the reception. That dress is looking a bit snug." Chloe's smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself. "Right," she said softly. "I'll keep that in mind." As they made their way to the car, David's phone buzzed incessantly. He scrolled through emails, barely glancing at Chloe as she carefully maneuvered into the passenger seat, mindful of her dress. "Big case?" Chloe asked, attempting to initiate conversation. "Always," David replied curtly, not looking up from his phone. "The Morrison merger is at a critical stage. I can't afford any distractions." The drive to the wedding venue was quiet, save for the soft classical music playing on the car's stereo. Chloe gazed out the window, her mind wandering to her Aunt Margaret. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral, and the weight of her secret inheritance felt heavy on her shoulders. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell David, hoping it might bring them closer, reignite the warmth that had slowly seeped out of their marriage over the years. As they pulled up to the picturesque country club where the wedding was being held, David finally pocketed his phone. "Remember," he said, turning to Chloe, "the Andersons will be here. Robert's considering bringing his company's legal affairs to our firm. Try not to embarrass me." Chloe nodded, swallowing the hurt his words caused. "Of course," she murmured. "I'll be on my best behavior." They made their way into the venue, David's hand resting lightly on the small of Chloe's back, a gesture more for show than affection. The ceremony space was beautifully decorated with white roses and twinkling lights, creating a romantic atmosphere. As they took their seats, Chloe spotted her friend Sophie, the bride's sister, waving enthusiastically from across the aisle. Chloe waved back, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "Who's that?" David whispered, his tone sharp. "Sophie. Remember? We had dinner with her and her husband last month," Chloe explained quietly. David's brow furrowed. "Ah, yes, the chatty one with the unremarkable husband. Best avoid getting trapped in conversation with her later." Chloe's smile dimmed, but she said nothing, focusing instead on the beautiful ceremony unfolding before them. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, she couldn't help but remember her own wedding day, 7 years ago. David had looked at her with such love then, promising to cherish and support her always. When had things changed? When had his ambition and desire for status overshadowed the man she'd fallen in love with? The reception that followed was a lavish affair. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set tables. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a refined backdrop to the guests' chatter. David immediately steered them towards Robert Anderson and his wife, a plastic smile plastered on his face. "Robert, so good to see you," he said, shaking the older man's hand firmly. As the men fell into a discussion about golf and business, Chloe found herself engaged in polite small talk with Mrs. Anderson. She was acutely aware of David's eyes on her, monitoring her every word and gesture. "So, Chloe, Mrs. Anderson said kindly. David tells us you used to work in publishing. Do you miss it? Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but David cut in smoothly. Oh, Chloe's much happier now, aren't you, dear? Being a homemaker suits her far better than the cutthroat world of business. Chloe felt a flush creep up her neck. Well, I do miss the intellectual stimulation sometimes, she admitted. David laughed a touch too loudly. Now, darling, we both know intellectual stimulation wasn't exactly your forte. Remember that time you mixed up Hemingway and Fitzgerald? Classic Chloe. The Andersons chuckled politely, but Chloe saw a flicker of discomfort in Mrs. Anderson's eyes. She took a sip of her champagne, wishing she could disappear into the bubbles. As the evening wore on, David's comments became increasingly cutting, each barb thinly veiled as a joke. Chloe endured it all with a fixed smile, her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the letter hidden in her desk drawer at home. The letter that could change everything. The wedding reception was in full swing, the dance floor crowded with jubilant guests moving to the upbeat music. Chloe stood at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of champagne and watching the revelry with a wistful expression. She caught sight of the newlyweds, their faces glowing with happiness as they swayed together, lost in their own world. Penny for your thoughts? Chloe turned to find Sophie beside her, a concerned look on her friend's face. Oh, just enjoying the atmosphere, Chloe replied, forcing a smile. Sophie wasn't fooled. I saw what happened earlier with David and the Andersons. Are you okay? Chloe's smile faltered. It's fine, really. David's just under a lot of pressure at work. Sophie placed a gentle hand on Chloe's arm. That's no excuse for how he's treating you. You deserve better, Chloe. Before Chloe could respond, David's voice boomed from across the room. Chloe! There you are. Come here, darling. The Johnsons want to meet you. Chloe excused herself and made her way to David's side. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close in a show of affection that felt more possessive than loving. This is my wife, Chloe, David announced to the couple before them. Chloe, meet Richard and Emma Johnson. Richard here is a senior partner at Blackstone and Reed. Chloe extended her hand, smiling warmly. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Likewise, Emma replied. David was just telling us about your culinary skills. He says you make a mean pot roast. Oh, well, I do enjoy cooking, Chloe said, feeling a small spark of pride. David chuckled. Yes, it's a good thing too. Lord knows she'd be lost in any other field. Numbers were never her strong suit, were they, sweetheart? Chloe felt her cheeks burn as the Johnsons laughed politely. She thought of the inheritance she'd been managing, the careful calculations and investment plans she'd been making in secret. If only David knew. Now, Richard said good-naturedly. I'm sure Chloe has many talents. Oh, absolutely, David agreed, his tone patronizing. She's an excellent homemaker, keeps the house spotless, always has dinner on the table. I'm a lucky man. As David continued to chat with the Johnsons, Chloe's mind wandered to the day she'd received news of her inheritance. Aunt Margaret had always been her favorite relative, the black sheep of the family who'd made her fortune in tech startups. They'd shared a special bond, and Margaret had seen a spark in Chloe that others, including David, seemed to miss. The memory of that day was bittersweet. She'd been both grieving her aunt's loss and reeling from the shock of the inheritance. Her first instinct had been to share the news with David, but something had held her back. Perhaps it was the way he'd dismissed her idea of taking an online course in business management just the week before. Darling, why don't you get us some more champagne? David's voice cut through her reverie. Chloe nodded, excusing herself from the group. As she made her way to the bar, she overheard snippets of conversation from nearby guests. Did you see how he spoke to her? Absolutely dreadful. Poor thing, she seems so sweet. I heard he's brilliant in the courtroom, but clearly he's a nightmare at home. Chloe quickened her pace, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She reached the bar and ordered 2 glasses of champagne, taking a moment to compose herself. Rough night? She looked up to see the bartender watching her sympathetically. Is it that obvious? Chloe asked with a weak laugh. The bartender shrugged. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone needs a moment. Take your time. Chloe smiled gratefully, taking a deep breath. She thought about the letter she'd written, safely tucked away in her desk drawer at home. The words she'd poured onto the page, explaining her decision to leave, revealing the inheritance, and expressing her disappointment in what their marriage had become. For a moment, she wondered if she was making the right choice. But then David's voice rang out across the room again, loud and slightly slurred from too much champagne. Chloe, where's that drink? Don't tell me you got lost on the way to the bar. The bartender raised an eyebrow, and Chloe's resolve strengthened. She grabbed the champagne glasses and made her way back to David, dodging pitying looks from other guests. As the night wore on, David's behavior became increasingly obnoxious. His jokes at Chloe's expense grew crueler, his voice louder. She endured it all with gritted teeth, counting down the minutes until they could leave. Finally, as the reception was winding down, David stumbled slightly, reaching for Chloe to steady himself. I think it's time we head home, don't you, sweetheart? He said, his words slightly slurred. Chloe nodded, relief washing over her. As they said their goodbyes, she caught Sophie's eye across the room. Her friend mouthed, "Call me," concern evident on her face. The drive home was tense, with David alternating between boasting about the connections he'd made and complaining about various guests. Chloe remained silent, her mind already on the letter waiting at home and the flight she'd booked for the following evening. As they pulled into their driveway, David turned to her, his expression suddenly softer. "You know I love you, right?" he said, reaching for her hand. Chloe looked at him, searching his face for a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with. "I know," she replied quietly, even as her heart ached with the knowledge that love shouldn't hurt this much. They made their way inside, David heading straight for bed while Chloe lingered in the living room. She glanced at her desk, thinking of the letter inside. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, everything changes. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the bedroom. David stirred, his head pounding from the previous night's overindulgence. He reached out, expecting to feel Chloe's warm presence beside him, but his hand met only cold, empty sheets. "Chloe?" he called out, his voice hoarse. No response. Groaning, David pushed himself up, squinting against the light. The events of the wedding reception came back to him in fragments. The networking, the drinks, the laughter. He remembered feeling on top of the world, charming potential clients and colleagues alike. But there was something else, a nagging feeling of unease that he couldn't quite place. He stumbled out of bed, pulling on his robe as he made his way downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, no smell of coffee brewing, no sound of Chloe's favorite morning radio show. "Chloe?" he called again, louder this time. Still nothing. David's eyes fell on a piece of paper on the kitchen counter, Chloe's neat handwriting immediately recognizable. His heart rate quickened as he picked it up, assuming it was a note explaining she'd gone out for groceries or to meet a friend for breakfast. But as he began to read, his blood ran cold. "David, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Last night at the wedding was the final straw in a long line of humiliations and disappointments. I've spent years trying to be the wife you wanted, dimming my own light to make yours shine brighter. But I can't do it anymore. There's something I've been keeping from you. 2 weeks ago, I inherited a substantial fortune from my late Aunt Margaret. I was planning to share this news with you, hoping it might bring us closer, give us a chance to start fresh. But your behavior last night made me realize that no amount of money can fix what's broken between us. I've transferred the entire inheritance to an account in my name only. By now, I'm on a flight to a destination you'll never know. Don't try to find me, David. It's over. I hope one day you'll understand the pain you've caused and become a better man for it. Goodbye, Chloe." David read the letter once, twice, 3 times, his hands shaking more with each pass. This couldn't be real. Chloe leaving him, an inheritance she'd kept secret. It had to be a joke, a misunderstanding. He rushed to the closet, flinging open the doors. Chloe's side was empty, hangers swaying gently where her clothes should have been. Her suitcases were gone. In the bathroom, her toiletries had vanished. It was as if she'd been erased from the house, leaving only the faintest trace of her favorite perfume lingering in the air. David sank onto the edge of the bed, his mind reeling. How had he not seen this coming? He thought back to the wedding, trying to piece together the events of the night. He remembered making jokes, networking, enjoying himself. But now, in the harsh light of day, snippets of conversation came back to him, tinged with a new, horrifying context. Had he really told the Johnsons that Chloe would be lost in any other field besides homemaking? Did he actually laugh about her mixing up authors, in front of the Andersons no less? Each remembered quip and jab felt like a physical blow now, the realization of how he'd treated Chloe washing over him in waves of shame and regret. He thought about the look in Chloe's eyes when he'd made those comments, the hurt she'd tried to hide, the way her smile had never quite reached her eyes. How long had she been planning this? How long had she been suffering in silence while he bulldozed over her feelings in his quest for status and success? David's gaze fell on a framed photo on the nightstand, a snapshot from their honeymoon. They were on a beach, sun-kissed and laughing. Chloe's arms wrapped around his neck as he held her close. The happiness radiating from that image felt like a mockery now, a bitter reminder of everything he'd thrown away. He reached for his phone, dialing Chloe's number with trembling fingers. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each unanswered call increasing his panic. In desperation, he called Sophie, Chloe's friend from the wedding. She answered on the third ring, her voice cold. "What do you want, David?" "Sophie, please," he begged. "I need to talk to Chloe. Do you know where she is?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sophie spoke again, her voice was laced with barely contained anger. "Even if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. You've done enough damage, David. Leave her alone." The line went dead. David stared at the phone in his hand, feeling more lost and alone than he ever had in his life. He spent the next few hours in a daze, alternating between frantic attempts to reach Chloe and moments of paralyzing despair. He called her parents, but they hadn't heard from her. He even considered calling the police, but realized he had no grounds for a missing person report. Chloe had left of her own free will. As the day wore on, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Chloe was gone, taking with her not just her presence, but the future he'd always taken for granted. The inheritance she mentioned, a fortune, she'd called it, could have changed their lives. They could have traveled, started a family, pursued new dreams together. But he'd squandered it all with his thoughtless words and actions. David found himself standing in front of the mirror, the same mirror he'd preened in front of just the night before. But the man staring back at him now was unrecognizable, disheveled, hollow-eyed, broken. For the first time, he saw himself as Chloe must have seen him, not the successful, charming lawyer he'd thought he was, but a cruel, self-absorbed man who had systematically torn down the one person who had loved him unconditionally. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty house, David realized that the biggest regret of his life wasn't losing the inheritance or the comfortable future it promised. It was losing Chloe and the knowledge that he had no one to blame but himself. The following days passed in a blur for David. He called in sick to work, unable to face his colleagues or clients. The thought of putting on his usual charming facade made him physically ill. Instead, he wandered the empty house like a ghost, reliving memories of Chloe in every room. In the kitchen, he found himself staring at the coffee maker she'd always had ready for him in the mornings. He'd never bothered to learn how to use it, always expecting her to have his coffee waiting. Now the machine sat silent and cold, much like the rest of the house. David's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from work and missed calls from confused friends who'd heard rumors of Chloe's departure. He ignored them all, focusing instead on trying to piece together where it had all gone wrong. On the third day after Chloe's disappearance, David found himself in her home office, a room he'd rarely entered before. It was here that he began to truly understand the extent of his neglect. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled not just with novels, but with business and finance books. A small desk in the corner held a laptop and a stack of notebooks. Curiosity overtook him, and he began to leaf through one of the notebooks. Inside, he found page after page of careful notes on investment strategies, business plans, and financial projections. The dates on these entries went back months, long before Chloe had received her inheritance. She was preparing, David muttered to himself, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. Chloe hadn't just stumbled into managing her inheritance. She'd been educating herself, planning for a future she hadn't shared with him. As he continued to explore, David uncovered more evidence of the woman he'd failed to see. There were certificates from online courses in business management and financial planning, tucked away in a drawer. A vision board hung on the back of the door, filled with images of travel destinations, entrepreneurial quotes, and pictures of strong, successful women. In one corner, partially hidden behind a potted plant, David found a small frame photo he'd never seen before. It showed Chloe with an older woman he recognized as her Aunt Margaret. They were both laughing, their heads close together as if sharing a secret. The joy and confidence in Chloe's expression was a stark contrast to the subdued woman he'd grown accustomed to seeing at home. David sank into Chloe's desk chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of her hidden life. How had he missed all of this? How had he failed to see the vibrant, ambitious woman right under his nose? He thought back to all the times Chloe had tried to engage him in conversations about her interests or aspirations. How many times had he brushed her off, too preoccupied with his own career to pay attention? How often had he belittled her ideas or dismissed her opinions, never considering that she might have valuable insights? The weight of his arrogance and neglect pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He'd been so caught up in his own success, so convinced of his own superiority, that he'd completely overlooked the incredible woman he'd married. As the reality of his loss continued to sink in, David's mind wandered to the future he'd unknowingly destroyed. He imagined Chloe using her inheritance and newfound knowledge to start her own business or invest in causes she cared about. He pictured her traveling the world, experiencing new cultures, and growing in ways he'd never allowed her to when they were together. The thought of Chloe flourishing without him brought a complex mix of emotions. Part of him felt proud of her strength and determination, while another part ached with regret for the partnership they could have had if he'd only been willing to see her as an equal. David's reverie was interrupted by a knock at the front door. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, he thought it might be Chloe, coming back to give him another chance. But when he opened the door, he found Sophie standing there, her expression a mix of anger and pity. "I'm here to pick up the rest of Chloe's things," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. David stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter. As Sophie moved through the house, efficiently packing Chloe's remaining belongings, David followed helplessly. "Is she okay?" he finally managed to ask as Sophie was zipping up a suitcase full of Chloe's books. Sophie paused, turning to face him. "She will be," she said firmly. "She's stronger than you ever gave her credit for." The words stung, but David knew they were true. "I know I messed up, Sophie. I never meant to hurt her. I love her." Sophie's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained resolute. "Sometimes, love isn't enough, David. Chloe needed respect, support, and partnership. You gave her none of those things." As Sophie prepared to leave, laden with the last remnants of Chloe's life in the house, David felt a desperate need to do something, anything, to make amends. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "if you talk to her, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I understand now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Sophie regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll tell her. But David, you need to understand. This isn't something you can fix with a grand gesture or a heartfelt apology. The damage was done over years, not in a single night. If you really want to make things right, start by taking a long, hard look at yourself. With that, Sophie left, closing the door behind her with a quiet finality that echoed through the empty house. David stood there, staring at the closed door, the full weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. In that moment, he made a decision. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the hurt he'd caused Chloe, but he could change himself. It would be a long, difficult process, but for the first time in years, David was ready to put in the work, not for his career or his status, but for his own growth as a human being. As he turned away from the door, his eye caught the wedding photo still hanging in the hallway. Looking at Chloe's radiant smile, he made a silent promise. Whether or not she ever came back, whether or not he ever got the chance to make things right with her, he would become the man she had always deserved. The weeks following Chloe's departure were a blur of self-reflection and painful realizations for David. He took a leave of absence from work, much to the surprise of his colleagues who had never known him, to prioritize anything over his career. In the quiet of the house that now felt too big and empty, David began the arduous process of examining his life and behaviors. He started seeing a therapist, Dr. Simmons, who helped him unpack years of ingrained attitudes and destructive patterns. In their sessions, David confronted the roots of his need for control and validation, tracing it back to his childhood and his father's impossible standards. "I always thought I was nothing like my father," David admitted during one particularly difficult session. "But I've become exactly what I swore I'd never be, someone who tears down the people closest to them." Dr. Simmons nodded thoughtfully. "Recognition is the first step, David. Now we can work on changing those patterns." At home, David immersed himself in books on emotional intelligence and healthy relationships. He joined a support group for men working to overcome toxic behaviors, finding both challenge and comfort in sharing experiences with others on similar journeys. One evening, as he was clearing out old files from his home office, David came across a stack of cards and letters from Chloe over the years. Reading through them, he was struck by the love and hope in her words, even as they changed tone over time, from joyful and optimistic to increasingly hesitant and subdued. The last card from just a few months ago read simply, "Happy birthday, David. I hope this year brings you happiness, love, Chloe." The brevity and formality of it compared to her earlier, more effusive messages hit David hard. He realized how much he had taken her love for granted, how he had slowly extinguished the light in her eyes. Motivated by this discovery, David decided to write Chloe a letter, not to beg for forgiveness or ask her to come back, but to acknowledge his failings and express his genuine remorse. He spent days drafting and redrafting, wanting to ensure every word was sincere and thoughtful. Finally satisfied, he sealed the letter and addressed it to Sophie, the only connection he had to Chloe's new life. Whether Sophie would pass it on or not, whether Chloe would read it or not, David knew this was an important step in his journey towards becoming a better person. As weeks turned into months, David slowly began to reconnect with the world outside his home. He volunteered at a local shelter, finding unexpected fulfillment in helping others without any expectation of personal gain. He reached out to old friends he had neglected in his single-minded pursuit of career success, rebuilding connections he had let wither. At work, colleagues noticed a change in David. He was more collaborative, more willing to listen to others' ideas. He championed a pro bono program to provide legal services to underprivileged communities, something he would have scoffed at just months earlier as a waste of billable hours. Though the ache of Chloe's absence never fully subsided, David found himself growing into a person he could be proud of, someone who might have been worthy of Chloe's love and respect. Whether or not he would ever get the chance to show her this change, he was committed to continuing on this path of growth and self-improvement. 6 months after Chloe's departure, David found himself standing outside a small cafe, his heart racing. Sophie had finally agreed to meet him, though she'd made it clear this wasn't an opportunity to get information about Chloe. As he entered, he spotted her at a corner table, her expression guarded. "Thank you for meeting me," David said, sliding into the seat across from her. Sophie nodded curtly. "I'm only here because Chloe's letter said you've been making changes. I wanted to see for myself." David took a deep breath. "I appreciate that. I know I have a lot to answer for." Over the next hour, David opened up to Sophie about his journey of self-discovery and change. He spoke about his therapy sessions, the support group, and the volunteer work he'd been doing. Sophie listened intently, her expression softening slightly as David shared his realizations and the steps he'd taken to address his toxic behaviors. "I'm not here to ask about Chloe or to try to get her back," David said finally. "I just want you to know that I understand the hurt I caused, and I'm committed to being better, not just for her, but for myself and for anyone else in my life." Sophie was quiet for a moment, studying him. "I can see you've put in work, David. That's commendable, but you need to understand that change doesn't erase the past." David nodded solemnly. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness or a second chance. I just hope that someday Chloe might know that her leaving wasn't in vain, that it sparked a real change in me." As they parted ways, Sophie hesitated. "Chloe's doing well, David. She started her own business, using her inheritance to fund educational programs for underprivileged women. She's happy." David felt a complex mix of emotions, pride, regret, and a bittersweet joy. "Thank you for telling me that. I'm glad she's thriving." Back at home, David reflected on the meeting with Sophie. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that Chloe was flourishing in her new life. It reinforced his commitment to continue his personal growth, regardless of the outcome. Weeks passed, and David threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. He spearheaded a mentorship program at his firm, focusing on supporting young female lawyers in their career development. His colleagues noticed the change, with some even commenting that he seemed like a different person. One evening, as David was leaving the office, he bumped into Robert Anderson, the potential client he'd been so eager to impress at the wedding. "David," Robert said, his tone surprisingly warm, "I heard about the mentorship program you've started. Impressive work." David smiled genuinely. "Thank you, Robert. It's something I'm passionate about." Robert nodded approvingly. "You know, I'll be honest. After that wedding, I had my doubts about working with your firm, but I've been hearing good things about the changes you've been making. I think we should set up a meeting to discuss bringing our business to you." David was taken aback. "I appreciate that, Robert, but I feel I owe you an apology for my behavior at the wedding. It was unprofessional and, more importantly, unkind. I've done a lot of reflection since then." Robert's expression softened. "We all make mistakes, David. It's how we learn from them that matters. Let's set up that meeting." As David headed home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. He was building a life and career he could be proud of, one that honored the lessons he'd learned from losing Chloe. At home, he found an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. His hands trembled as he opened it, recognizing Chloe's handwriting immediately. "David, Sophie told me about your meeting and the changes you've been making. I'm glad to hear you're doing the work to better yourself. I want you to know that I'm doing well. My business is thriving, and I'm finding fulfillment in ways I never imagined possible when we were together. I'm not ready for direct contact, and I don't know if I ever will be. But I wanted you to know that I see your efforts, and I hope you continue on this path, not for me, but for yourself. Take care, Chloe." David read the letter several times, tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an invitation back into her life, but it was acknowledgement, and for now, that was enough. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, a reminder of how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. A year had passed since Chloe's departure, and David's life had taken on a new rhythm. His days were filled with meaningful work, both at the law firm and in his volunteer activities. The mentorship program he'd started was flourishing, and he found genuine satisfaction in helping young lawyers, especially women, navigate the challenges of the legal profession. One crisp autumn morning, David received an unexpected invitation. The local bar association was hosting a charity gala, and they wanted him to speak about the importance of ethical practices and inclusivity in the legal field. As he read the email, he couldn't help but reflect on how different his reaction would have been a year ago. Back then, he would have seen it as just another networking opportunity, a chance to boost his ego and status. Now, he felt a sense of responsibility to share the hard-earned lessons of his personal journey. As the day of the gala approached, David found himself both nervous and excited. He spent hours crafting his speech, determined to strike the right balance between professional insight and personal vulnerability. The night of the event, he stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie. The face that looked back at him was older perhaps, but there was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The gala was a glittering affair, filled with the city's most prominent legal professionals. As David mingled before his speech, he was struck by how different these interactions felt now. He listened more than he spoke, asked genuine questions, and found himself actually interested in the answers. When it was time for his speech, David took a deep breath and approached the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all waiting expectantly. "Good evening," he began. "A year ago, I stood at a similar event, surrounded by colleagues and peers, and I thought I had it all figured out. I was wrong." A hush fell over the room as David shared his story. He spoke about the arrogance that had blinded him, the casual cruelty he had inflicted on the person he claimed to love most. He talked about the wake-up call of losing everything that truly mattered and the hard work of rebuilding himself from the ground up. "Our profession often rewards aggression and a win-at-all-costs mentality," he said. "But true success, true fulfillment, comes from integrity, empathy, and a commitment to lifting others as we climb." As he concluded his speech, David noticed a few moist eyes in the audience. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. After he stepped down from the podium, several colleagues approached him, sharing their own stories of struggles and growth. Later that evening, as the gala was winding down, David found himself in conversation with a young lawyer named Emily. She had recently joined his firm and was part of the mentorship program. "Your speech really resonated with me," Emily said. "It's not often we hear senior partners speak so openly about their mistakes and the need for change." David smiled warmly. "I've learned that vulnerability can be a strength, Emily. It allows us to connect authentically and learn from each other." As they chatted, David noticed a familiar figure across the room. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized Chloe. She was engaged in animated conversation with a group of people, her face alight with confidence and passion. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Chloe gave him a small, acknowledging nod before turning back to her conversation. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was something, a recognition of the changes they had both undergone. David excused himself from Emily and stepped out onto the venue's balcony, needing a moment to process the unexpected encounter. The cool night air helped clear his head as he gazed out at the city lights. He realized that seeing Chloe didn't fill him with the desperate longing he might have expected. Instead, he felt a complex mix of emotions, a tinge of regret for what might have been, yes, but also a genuine happiness to see her thriving. It was a bittersweet confirmation that they had both grown, albeit apart. As David drove home that night, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The man who had stood in this same hotel a year ago, carelessly wounding the person he claimed to love, was gone. In his place was someone who understood the value of kindness, the strength in vulnerability, and the importance of continual growth. The house was quiet when he arrived home, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with the presence of the person he had become, someone he was finally learning to respect and appreciate. As he drifted off to sleep, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for the painful but necessary journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years after Chloe's departure, David's life had settled into a new normal. His work at the law firm continued to evolve, with a focus on ethical practices and mentorship that had become his trademark. The pro bono program he championed was making a real difference in the community, providing legal aid to those who couldn't afford it. On a sunny Saturday morning, David found himself at a local community center, participating in a legal clinic for small business owners. As he advised a young entrepreneur on the intricacies of contract law, he couldn't help but think of Chloe and the business she had started. He wondered how she was doing, hoping her venture was thriving. As the clinic wound down, David noticed a flyer on the community board advertising a women's empowerment conference. The keynote speaker caught his eye. It was Chloe. His heart raced as he read the details. The conference was scheduled for the following weekend, open to the public. All week, David debated whether or not to attend. He didn't want to intrude on Chloe's space or make her uncomfortable, but the desire to see her in her element, to witness the success she had achieved, was strong. Finally, he decided to go, promising himself he would remain inconspicuous and leave immediately if his presence seemed unwelcome. The day of the conference arrived, and David found himself in the back of a packed auditorium. As Chloe took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked confident and radiant, her passion evident as she began to speak about empowering women in business. 2 years ago, I was in a place where I felt voiceless and undervalued, Chloe began. But sometimes, the darkest moments in our lives can lead us to our true calling. David listened intently as Chloe shared her journey, from feeling trapped in an unhappy marriage to discovering her own strength and purpose. She spoke about the challenges of starting her own business, the importance of supporting other women, and the power of believing in oneself. As he watched her, David felt a complex mix of emotions. There was pride in seeing how far she had come, regret for the years he had held her back, and a bittersweet joy in witnessing her success. He realized that the pain of their separation had led to growth for both of them. After the speech, there was a Q&A session. David remained silent, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But as people began to file out, he found himself moving towards the stage where Chloe was chatting with some attendees. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Chloe's expression was one of surprise, quickly replaced by a cautious smile. As the last of her admirers moved away, David approached. "Hello, Chloe," he said softly. "Your speech was incredible." Chloe regarded him for a moment before responding. "Thank you, David. I'm surprised to see you here." "I hope it's okay that I came," he said. "I saw the flyer and I wanted to see how you were doing. You seem to be thriving." Chloe nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. "I am. It's been a challenging journey, but a rewarding one. How about you? I've heard about some of the changes at your firm." They fell into a conversation that was both familiar and new. David shared some of his experiences over the past 2 years, the therapy, the mentorship program, the pro bono work. Chloe listened attentively, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear you found a new direction," she said finally. "It sounds like you've done a lot of work on yourself." David nodded. "I have, and I want to thank you, Chloe. Your leaving, it was the wake-up call I needed. I'm sorry it took losing you to realize how much I needed to change." Chloe's expression softened. "I'm sorry too, for the pain we both went through. But I'm glad we've both found our paths." As their conversation drew to a close, there was a moment of awkward silence. Then Chloe spoke. "David, I'm meeting some colleagues for dinner to celebrate the conference. Would you like to join us?" David was taken aback by the invitation. "Are you sure? I wouldn't want to intrude." Chloe smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I'm sure. I think we're both in a place where we can celebrate each other's successes, don't you?" As they walked out of the auditorium together, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. They weren't the same people they had been during their marriage, but perhaps they could forge a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect and genuine goodwill. The dinner with Chloe and her colleagues marked a turning point in David's life. While it didn't lead to a romantic reconciliation, it opened the door to a new kind of relationship with Chloe, one of mutual respect and occasional friendship. Over the next few months, they exchanged sporadic emails, sharing professional achievements and words of encouragement. As the third anniversary of Chloe's departure approached, David found himself reflecting on the profound changes in his life. His law firm had become known for its ethical practices and commitment to diversity, attracting clients who valued these principles. The mentorship program he'd started had expanded to other firms in the city, creating a network of support for young lawyers, especially women and minorities. One crisp autumn morning, David received an unexpected email from a prestigious law school. They were inviting him to be a guest lecturer for a series on ethics in legal practice. The old David would have seen this as another feather in his cap, a chance to boost his ego. The new David saw it as an opportunity to share the hard-won lessons of his journey and potentially influence the next generation of lawyers. As he prepared for his first lecture, David decided to reach out to Chloe for advice. Her experience in public speaking and empowerment could be valuable. To his surprise, she agreed to meet him for coffee to discuss his approach. They met at a small cafe near the university campus. As Chloe walked in, David was struck by how at ease she seemed, confident, relaxed, and radiating a sense of purpose. "So, Professor David," Chloe said with a small smile as she sat down, "how does it feel to be shaping young minds?" David chuckled. "Terrifying, to be honest. I want to make sure I'm sending the right message." They spent the next hour discussing David's lecture plans. Chloe offered insightful suggestions, encouraging him to incorporate real-world examples and interactive elements to engage the students. As their conversation wound down, Chloe paused, her expression turning serious. "David, I want you to know, I'm proud of the work you've done. The changes you've made, they're real and impactful." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Chloe. That means more than you know. I just wish I had realized sooner, before I hurt you so deeply." Chloe reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "We can't change the past, David, but we can learn from it and use those lessons to shape a better future. That's what you're doing now." As they parted ways, David felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The guilt and regret that had been his constant companions for the past 3 years began to lift, replaced by a determination to continue on his path of growth and positive impact. The day of his first lecture arrived. As David stood before the class of eager law students, he took a deep breath and began. "3 years ago, I thought I had it all figured out," he started. "I was a successful lawyer, winning cases, making money, but I was also arrogant, self-centered, and blind to the damage I was causing to those around me, especially to the person I claimed to love the most." He went on to share his story, the wake-up call of losing Chloe, the hard work of self-reflection and change, and the ongoing journey of becoming a better person and professional. The students listened intently, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of the challenges he described. "Ethics in legal practice isn't just about following rules," David concluded. "It's about understanding the impact of our actions, valuing empathy and integrity as much as we value winning, and recognizing that true success comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." As the lecture ended, several students approached David with questions and comments. One young woman hung back until the others had left. "Mr. Pearson," she said hesitantly, "your story, it resonated with me. I've been struggling with the competitive nature of law school, feeling like I need to be cutthroat to succeed. But hearing about your journey, it's given me hope that there's another way." David smiled warmly. "There absolutely is. Success doesn't have to come at the cost of your integrity or your relationships. In fact, I've found that embracing empathy and ethics has made me a better lawyer and a happier person." As he packed up his materials, David felt a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced in his old life. He had taken the painful lessons of his past and used them to potentially change the course of these young lawyers' careers and lives. Leaving the lecture hall, David's phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. "How did it go?" He smiled as he typed his reply. "Better than I could have imagined. Thank you for your help and support." As he walked to his car, David felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew there was still work to be done. But for the first time in years, he felt truly aligned with his values, using his experiences, both good and bad, to make a positive impact on the world around him. 5 years had passed since the fateful wedding that had changed everything. David stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. This time, he wasn't preparing for a corporate event or a court appearance. He was getting ready for Chloe's wedding. The invitation had arrived 3 months ago, surprising and touching him deeply. It was a testament to how far they had both come, how much they had grown. Chloe was marrying a kind-hearted entrepreneur she had met through her women's empowerment network. David had met him once and could see the genuine love and respect between them. As David drove to the venue, he reflected on the journey of the past 5 years. His law firm had become a beacon of ethical practice in the legal community. The mentorship program he started had expanded nationally, changing the lives of countless young lawyers. He had found purpose and fulfillment in his work, far beyond the hollow success he once chased. Arriving at the beautiful garden where the ceremony was to take place, David was greeted warmly by Sophie, Chloe's old friend. "It's good to see you, David," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "Chloe will be glad you came." The ceremony was intimate and beautiful. As Chloe walked down the aisle, radiant in her wedding gown, David felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a twinge of regret for what might have been, but it was overshadowed by genuine happiness for her. She had found the love and respect she deserved. During the reception, David found a moment to speak with Chloe privately. "Congratulations," he said, smiling warmly. "I'm so happy for you, Chloe." Chloe's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you, David. It means a lot that you're here." She paused, then added, "You know, in a strange way, I'm grateful for everything that happened. It led us both to where we needed to be." David nodded, understanding completely. "I feel the same way. You taught me the most important lesson of my life, Chloe. I'll always be thankful for that." As they parted, David felt a sense of closure. The chapter of his life with Chloe was truly over, but it had shaped him into the man he was today, a man he could be proud of. Later that evening, as David prepared to leave, he bumped into Robert Anderson, the client from that fateful wedding years ago. "David," Robert said, shaking his hand warmly, "I was just telling my wife how your firm's ethical approach has transformed our business practices. You've made quite an impact." David smiled, genuinely touched. "Thank you, Robert. That means a lot." As he drove home, David felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. He had lost Chloe, but in doing so, he had found himself. He had learned the value of kindness, empathy, and integrity. He had discovered that true success wasn't measured in wins or wealth, but in the positive impact one could have on others. David pulled into his driveway, noticing the warm glow of lights from inside. His girlfriend, Emma, a kind-hearted lawyer he'd met through his mentorship program, would be waiting. As he walked towards the door, he smiled, grateful for the painful lesson that had set him on this path. The man who had once carelessly hurt others was gone. In his place stood someone who understood the true meaning of love, respect, and success. David opened the door, ready to embrace the life he had built, a life of purpose, integrity, and genuine happiness. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.